That may be the greatest catch I've ever seen in my life.
Okay, as we did with running backs, quarterbacks, and tight ends, we are going through and we are looking at where these rookies rank not only against each other, but in our overall Dynasty startup rankings. Now, y'all probably saw that we updated these rankings over there on Patreon to include the rookies in the startup rankings, not just in their own category, couple weeks ago, but we're skiing. So yeah, we're going to get this video to you right now because I'm not in Florida. But of course, before we get into it, please go down there, drop a like on this video, subscribe to the channel only if you play Dynasty Fantasy Football. And of course, feel free to leave a comment letting me know how stupid I am. Going to be excited to read all those comments and go, I promise I'm not stupid. I'm not. Why do you say that mean thing to me? But nonetheless, I like your mean comments. And let's go over to our wide receiver 1 in this rookie class. And if you pull up our Dynasty rookie rankings, you are going to see that we have a top tier of 3 names and 3 names alone. Treylon Burks, Garrett Wilson, and Drake London. Now, with these wide receivers, I guess we can go through a quick overview and why I think that they are so close where they stack up currently in our Dynasty rankings and just overall Dynasty market value. Now, of course, I mean, these guys are going to separate themselves. Once we get the NFL draft capital, which doesn't matter as much for these wide receivers as it will for running back and quarterback, but probably more importantly, once we get their landing spots and we can understand the role that they will have in their respective offense and just the overall pace of play in the game that they are going to be in, then I think that we can be a lot more confident in, say, having Treylon Burks at 1 overall. Because if we pull up grindingthemocks.com right now, let me do this just to make sure I am correct as we talk out of our ass. But right now, Garrett Wilson is supposed to be the first wide receiver selected off the board. Now, of course, this is mainly just based off of a lot of people going through and completing NFL mock drafts, and these are going to get more and more accurate as we get closer to the actual NFL combine, as we get closer to the actual NFL draft. But as of now, I mean, this is pretty much all we have to work with if we're talking about actual draft projections. But right now, Garrett Wilson is supposed to go around pick 14. I mean, he's ahead of Treylon Burks. He's ahead of Drake London in current NFL draft circles. And I can understand why. Now, personally, I don't necessarily think anything separates these wide receivers as with Garrett Wilson. I mean, if you're looking at the production profile for him, I mean, honestly, he's not as impressive as Drake London. He's not as impressive as Treylon Burks if we're just looking at pure market share numbers. Now, of course, I mean, Dynasty Fantasy Football can't just be numbers on a spreadsheet. You need to also have a complex understanding of those numbers with the situations that they were in, and you have to be able to adjust accordingly. And with Garrett Wilson, we've talked about this time and time again. I mean, playing alongside Chris Olave, as well as, I mean, Jameson Williams, someone we'll talk about later in this video. I mean, you're not expecting him to have that just dominant alpha wide receiver performance as a freshman or a sophomore. And then Jackson Smith, I don't know how to say the name and I will never know. I mean, coming in that third year that Garrett Wilson was at Ohio State, he actually took over as the wide receiver 1. And Jackson Smith, if he was in this class, he would easily be the wide receiver 1. He looks like he's a Jamar Chase level prospect, maybe even from a prospect perspective, a little bit better based on him being able to lead this team at such a young age in receiving yards per game, targets per game, crushing both Chris Olave and Garrett Wilson, who will both be first-round picks in this year's NFL draft. But with Garrett Wilson, I'm willing to overlook the fact that he was never the wide receiver 1 on his own offense, given just the amount of talent that he played with at Ohio State. And he still managed to, at the same age, go and just completely push a player like Jameson Williams off the field and say, you know what, buddy, you're probably best off just staying on the sideline here, letting Chris Olave and myself take care of things. And you have to look at the fact that, I mean, Jameson Williams, another player that's going to be going in the first round of this year's NFL draft. And I think that kind of speaks volumes on how Garrett Wilson was able to just kind of go and navigate through a wide receiver room that at one point had 4 future first round NFL draft selections and be able to be a consistent player on the field, drawing targets at a higher rate while at Goff's never been number one on his own team. But still, I mean, the wide receiver 1A, wide receiver 1B type situation you had it in Ohio State was a very unique one. So I think that if we look at the context of his situation and also the projected NFL draft capital and what NFL teams are currently thinking, you can see the argument to have Garrett Wilson as the wide receiver 1 overall. I'm going to ignore that, and instead I'm going to have Treylon Burks here. I actually think once we get to the NFL Combine, I mean, Treylon Burks will separate himself just as, I mean, a size-adjusted speed athlete. I mean, this is going to be a freak athlete, and that doesn't matter nearly as much at the wide receiver position in terms of projecting them to the next level, but a lot of people that play Dynasty think it does, and I promise you, once we get to the NFL Combine and we have those wide receivers with their official 40 times, you're going to get some hype going for some players. Treylon Burks is going to be one of those guys. Why I am most excited about Treylon Burks is clearly the production profile that he had at Arkansas. I mean, he's not going out there averaging 150 receiving yards a game, but I mean, if you're looking at the fact that he averaged half of their receiving touchdowns, and at the same time, he had about 45% of their receiving yards on a per game basis, those market numbers in a dominant conference, I mean, is pretty impressive to say the least. And then Drake London, I mean, this is a wide receiver that if it wasn't for the injury, I think I could have a strong argument, and it's easily in the range of outcomes. Right now, he's in tier 1 for us to have him as the wide receiver 1. As with Drake London, this is an option that was neck and neck with Michael Pittman in terms of the amount of snaps that they were getting, the amount of targets that they were drawing. His true freshman season at 17 years old, Drake London was an every down player at USC. And then his sophomore year, he comes out, he's more productive than Amara St. Brown, who obviously had to break out his own rookie season, but at a younger age, Drake London was more productive. And then this past year, he accounts for almost 50%. Now, he doesn't get to exactly 50%, but almost 50% of USC's passing yards on a per game basis went to Drake London. Not to mention that he has the size of Mike Evans. Size doesn't matter as much at the wide receiver position as just the overall contextualized production, as we discussed, but it's better to be the size of Drake London than it is to be the size of Rondell Moore, because when you have that breakout, people are going to get more excited and your dynasty value can skyrocket. I think that all three of these wide receivers have, I mean, reasons to be very excited about them, but at the same time, you have some red flags. You have the red flag with the Drake London injury. You have the red flag with Treylon Burks. I know a lot of people say that he can't run the full route tree. I'm not a professional NFL scout. Neither are you. Neither is anybody else on YouTube, just to let you know that. And with Garrett Wilson, obviously, he has the concerns just based on the fact that he was never able to dominate targets at Ohio State, which we have to definitely at least keep in mind. So with their respective red flags, as well as the positives on their profile, and the positives definitely outweigh the negatives here, I'm going to be hesitant to say these wide receiver options are just truly can't miss players. And to go along with this, that these wide receiver options are anything different than each other. So I'm going to have them not only ranked back to back to back in our overall rookie rankings, but I have them ranked that same way in our overall dynasty startup rankings. Now, maybe this is just me being lazy. Let me know if you think that there's a larger gap between these rookie wide receivers than I'm currently giving credit for. But I have Treylon Burks as our wide receiver 17, Garrett Wilson as our wide receiver 18, and Drake London as our wide receiver 19 in our overall dynasty startup rankings. And I understand that sounds low initially, but I would encourage everybody here to spend an afternoon and try to go through, and over there on Patreon, we have a total of 63 wide receivers ranked. Try to rank your top 63 wide receivers into tiers and in as an exact order over there, because you're going to realize there are a ton of talented wide receivers. We have this tier of options directly behind the tier of Calvin Ridley, DJ Moore, and Chris Godwin, all of whom have shown the ability to be wide receiver 1s in fantasy previously. And in the case of Chris Godwin and DJ Moore, still extremely young options that are just now stepping into the prime of their career. And we've discussed that age doesn't matter nearly as much at the wide receiver position as it will at running back. And with Calvin Ridley, I know he's a little bit older, 27, but we just discussed the fact that Calvin Ridley is one of the very few players that we have seen that actually has that upside to be just a league-breaking wide receiver, to be Devonte Adams, Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp. We saw that back in 2020 from Calvin Ridley. So I'm fine having those options ranked ahead of these rookies. I mean, some other players include Deontay Johnson, Stephon Diggs, DK Metcalf, T. Higgins. I mean, that's the tier of guys that we have directly ahead of that Calvin Ridley, DJ Moore, Chris Godwin tier. And same argument to be said there. We've already seen the elite flashes from those players at the NFL level. I don't think we have to be worried about any of those options flaming out. And at the same time, none of them are really that old outside of Stephon Diggs, but Stephon Diggs can easily be a top 3 wide receiver this upcoming season. So let me know if you think that any of these rookies should be ranked ahead of these players. I mean, the tier below the Treylon Burks tier, we have Terry McLaurin and Devonte Smith. I mean, here with Smith, I think all of these rookie wide receiver prospects are a better prospect than Smith was once we got his weight measurement. Of course, from a production standpoint, Devonte Smith was an elite player, but I have to be a little bit concerned about the weight. And also, y'all know, I mean, I hate that people call me a Jalen Hurts hater because I've been adamant for 2 years that Jalen Hurts was one of the best values in Dynasty. I mean, where were y'all when we were drafting Jalen Hurts literally in almost every single draft? So don't call me that Jalen Hurts hater, but here with Jalen Hurts, we've already discussed. I think at this point we can say, well, maybe he's taken a step forward. I'm going to see him as a very limited passer. I don't think it's a great situation for Devonte Smith going forward. And I think that we really have to hope that the Philadelphia Eagles don't decide to draft one of these wide receivers like Treylon Burks, Garrett Wilson, or Drake London in the middle of the first round, because that player would be falling in my dynasty rankings, definitely. So we're going to have Devonte Smith under them. I'm also going to have Terry McLaurin under them as well. I mean, with McLaurin in particular, this is a wide receiver that I know a lot of people want to just assume that he has been that elite level option previously. But in reality, if you go through and if you look at the production, I mean, y'all know I wasn't a big fan of Terry McLaurin coming into this past season, whether or not we were talking from a redraft perspective or if we were talking from a dynasty perspective. The production really has never been there. And I understand that the quarterback play hasn't been either, but Terry McLaurin this year, wide receiver 33 on a per game basis in 2020. I mean, everybody thought he was God's greatest gift to earth. Wide receiver 21 on a per game basis. And if we're going back to 2019, I understand this is his rookie season, but still, I mean, it's a year that we can look at. Wide receiver 29 on a per game basis. So the best we have ever gotten from Terry McLaurin is a wide receiver 2 performance, a low end wide receiver 2 performance. I mean, this is a wide receiver at the same time that stayed all 5 years at Ohio State himself. So he is already 26 years old. He's going to be 27 by the time the season starts. So I'm going to prefer all these rookie wide receivers as well over Terry McLaurin. It's an interesting spot. I feel like we could end up getting a good landing spot for Treylon Burks, Garrett Wilson, or Drake London, jumping them up alongside a player like T. Higgins. But for now, I think that we have to keep these players a little bit lower before we actually have the official data points that we can be looking at with the offenses that they're going to be playing in. And now let's go a decent mark down. Let's go down to our wide receiver 4 in this draft class. Let me just make sure we're not missing anybody, but I believe this is going to be Chris Olave. And I've never really thought that I was going to be the leader of the Chris Olave's undervalued movement, but I think at this point, Olave is a fantastic value because if we're looking at him compared to a wide receiver that everybody wants to have over him, someone like Jameson Williams, where right now I will be the first person to admit, we go over to grinding the mocks. I mean, as of February 13th, I mean, you actually have Jameson Williams as a wide receiver that's projected to go ahead of Chris Olave only by 1 pick, but still, nonetheless, in that same exact range, I personally can't get there. I know Chris Olave stayed all 4 years at Ohio State, which is something that you really don't want to see. I mean, a player that's coming out after all 4 years, we'll talk about Dotson in a second, should inherently have a lower hit rate than what you actually see with those true juniors coming out. A lot of people focus in on Jamar Chase versus Devonte Smith with this same statement this past season. But Chris Olave is a little bit of a different player because if we look at Chris Olave, he's 21 and a half years old. I mean, if we're comparing this to some of the other wide receivers that are coming out in this same draft class, Garrett Wilson, the wide receiver at that same school that was only there for 3 years, is a month younger than him. They are the same exact age. Chris Olave got to Ohio State at 17 years old. I don't necessarily think that we should hold that against him if he wants to somehow get there at 17 and then decide to stay all 4 years. So he's the same exact age as all the true juniors coming out this season. And with Chris Olave, I'm going to have him ahead of Jameson Williams because if we go back to these wide receivers, the same age in the same offense, Chris Olave dominated Williams. Dominated to the point where he couldn't get on the field and he had to transfer. Like, we've seen them in the same wide receiver room. And I know we had a comment of someone leaving, just, in my opinion, a misguided explanation saying, okay, well, we weren't in the locker room. We don't know why he had to transfer. We don't know what happened. Yeah. So why are we just going to be making excuses saying that with Williams, he pissed off the coaching staff and that's why Olave got the job? I'm operating under the assumption, unless we're told differently, I don't even care if we're told differently in this specific scenario, that the reason Chris Olave was on the field is because the coaching staff thought he was the better wide receiver. And they are the ones that got to evaluate them by standing in front of them after recruiting them. So I'm willing to bet that Chris Olave is the wide receiver 4 in this draft class. Now, if we're looking at the tier of players that I decided to put Chris Olave in, I'm going to put him alongside some players that were selected in the first round yet have been disappointing so far in their NFL careers, as well as some day 3 options that actually, hit. Like, the perfect example is we have him directly ahead of Jerry Jeudy and Amon-Ra St. Brown. With St. Brown, obviously, a fantastic wide receiver his rookie season. But if you ask me the question, Mason, what happens if, the Los Angeles Rams decide to trade up, take Chris Olave at the 20th pick overall? Who's going to outproduce each other over the next 3 years between St. Brown and Chris Olave? I probably would actually take Chris Olave in that instance. Now, we're also going to have him ahead of Rashad Bateman, Chase Claypool, and Dardell Mooney. So there are wide receivers here that, yes, have flashed early in their NFL careers, but didn't necessarily have the profile coming out of school. But you have to bump them up given the early production that you've had. Someone like Dardell Mooney is the perfect example. And I know with Dardell Mooney, this is a wide receiver that everybody thinks just came out and smashed in fantasy. I am still very pessimistic about the Chicago Bears situation, as Dardell Mooney was the wide receiver 36 on a per game basis this past year. So a low end wide receiver 3, high end wide receiver 4. So I know that people probably aren't going to agree with me on this one. I'm probably a little bit higher on Chris Olave than you are, but I'm fine having him as the wide receiver 31. And going over to a couple of those other players we were previously discussing, we got Jahan Dotson as well as Jameson Williams at 43 and 44, behind players like Hunter Renfrow, Odell Beckham Jr., Mike Williams, and Tyler Lockett. So behind some of these veteran options, and Jameson Williams should be a first-round pick in the NFL draft. My issue is, just not being able to break out till his true junior season. That is going to be a major red flag if you're looking at the boxes that we are trying to check, and we want those players breaking out as true sophomores. And B, with Williams, the significant injury is going to make it where he's not going to be able to get on the field for his NFL team in training camp or probably rookie minicamp and also the preseason. So if he's going to be missing, that significant portion of time, we don't even know if he's going to be good for the start of the NFL season. That could backtrack his development. Not every player's Odell Beckham Jr. and going to be able to overcome something like that. And with Dotson, this is an option that I know we just gave a pass to Chris Olave for, but I am worried about those guys that stay all 4 years in school, especially a player like Jahan Dotson's the perfect example of this, where you actually see him going and breaking out in year 3 rather than year 2. So he breaks out as a true junior. And I know, we kind of made excuses for this happening with Devonte Smith as well, and why Devonte Smith last year had to stay all 4 years. But the difference was, a player like Smith, you can see why he has to stay all 4 years in school whenever he's competing for targets with guys like Jerry Jeudy, Henry Ruggs, and Jalen Waddle his entire time at Alabama. Whereas Dotson doesn't really have that same excuse at Penn State. By the time he gets there, Chris Godwin is already in the NFL. So really, there's not too much that we need to be looking at in terms of excuses in adjusting his production early on in his collegiate career and why he maybe had to stay all 4 seasons. It's going to be a major red flag for me. So I would prefer those guys. Even someone, I apologize, we skipped over David Bell. David Bell, our wide receiver 5. Let me backtrack over to David Bell real quick. David Bell, the perfect example of a wide receiver that's going to be better for fantasy than he is going to be in the NFL draft. David Bell should be going behind players like Dotson. I mean, he's going to be going behind someone like Jameson Williams, but David Bell is going to win with volume rather than actually being a field stretching option. So he's going to be a little bit less valuable in the NFL. So I'll be willing to bet on David Bell over these other players. And also, he has the production profile, came out after 3 years out of Purdue, broke out at an early age. And with David Bell, I have him in the same tier as Kadarius Toney. We have him one spot ahead of Kadarius Toney, and I have him behind Chase Claypool, Dardell Mooney, Rashad Bateman, Amara St. Brown, and Jerry Jeudy, because I think you look at a couple of those other profiles, they're better prospects, and a couple of those other guys more productive their rookie seasons. But let's go down to a wide receiver that, I mean, we recently have moved up, and this is going to be George Pickens. Now, with Pickens, it's going to be very hard to fairly evaluate him given the injuries that he had at Georgia, but this is a player that was fantastic as an 18-year-old true freshman. Let me pull this up real quick for what you actually had with George Pickens in college. And in 2019 at Georgia, he comes out and he has 727 receiving yards in 12 games. And of course, that doesn't necessarily seem that impressive, but if you put it in the context of the Georgia offense, keep in mind, this is a team that just dominates and runs the ball. I mean, they only had 223 passing yards on a per game basis. I mean, this is a team that George Pickens was the wide receiver 1 on at 18 years old. We're talking Georgia. Okay, so, I mean, he was dominant at an early age. We don't have much to look at beyond that. He also had a very impressive sophomore year. It's really, can he overcome the injuries? And right now, he is skyrocketing up NFL mock drafts compared to where people thought he was going previously. I mean, right now, he is projected to be the wide receiver 7 off the board, according to Grinding the Mocks going at the beginning of the second round. Because of the upside, as well as the incomplete profile, it's going to be a lot harder to rank someone like George Pickens. I have him in the same tier as players like Adam Thielen, Michael Gallup, Robert Woods, Brandon Cooks, Juju Smith-Schuster. I know this seems very low, but at the same time, I think maybe this goes along with just the overall theme that I'm going to be willing to ride out these veteran productive wide receivers like Robert Woods a little bit longer than most other people are. That if you can tell me I'm going to definitely get a top 15 wide receiver season over the next 2 years for Robert Woods, with my expected hit rate on George Pickens, I probably would just take the production overall. But of course, it really does come down to your overall league situation. And now let's go to our next 2 wide receivers. Going to be wide receiver 59 and 60 for us. Going to be Justin Ross and Rondell Robinson. And here with Rondell Robinson and Justin Ross, Ross is the more exciting player, in my opinion, because with Ross, if you look at the production that he had with T. Higgins in that Clemson offense at 18 years old, Justin Ross was right there with T. Higgins, like giving T. Higgins a run for his money on pretty much any metric that you look at. And obviously with Justin Ross as well, he's an extremely young wide receiver. You know what? I want to put him significantly higher than this. I want to put him right next to where you have someone like George Pickens. The issue is obviously just the devastating neck injury. I mean, whenever that was announced, a lot of people in the Devy community thought Ross was never going to play football again. I mean, he was able to come back clearly, but we don't know exactly how long that's going to be. We don't know what the NFL is going to do, because we have seen before whenever players have uncertain injuries that the NFL is willing to just let them fall and fall and fall. And I don't want to be taking Justin Ross over someone like Gabriel Davis. Then all of a sudden, Justin Ross goes in round 5, round 6 of the NFL draft. And our last wide receiver, I'm not really on him. We have him in the same tier as Van Jefferson and Laviska Shenault, is going to be John Mechie. I'm not a big fan. I know that he has the excuse of being in that Alabama offense alongside Smith as well as Jalen Waddle and not being able to produce early, but still at the same time, I mean, if I'm not going to be a big fan of Jameson Williams, and Jameson Williams went out there and dominated over John Mechie this past season, I mean, I feel like I would be fraudulent to then just completely turn the corner and say, oh, John Mechie, a great value in Dynasty. And I think that's all we got for this video. Really hope y'all enjoyed it. Really hope you got something from it. Please go down there, drop a like, leave a comment, let me know how stupid I am, subscribe to the channel. And I think that should be it. Hope you have a great day.